Hello and welcome to the Confidence Budget 2019. The elections have given the government a mandate of confidence, and the budget has to give back the confidence to the mandate. It's a budget where the government needs to inform aptly, to reform correctly, to enable us to perform and take India ahead. A great election victory means a great electoral responsibility. And it also comes with great expectations. Expectations on several parts of the economy. And that's what our roundtable does. It discusses a 360 on jobs, on the fiscal situation, on growth, on taxes, on the government policy as well. Well, so far we've talked about jobs and growth. This segment talks about the fiscal deficit. If you can't own it, simply loan it. That's been the mantra of the world's largest democracy, which gets wired as it spends more, earns more, but most of the spending happens because it manages to borrow more. And what it results in is it finds itself long on debt and short on credibility and efficiency. And the interest burden, well, it simply multiplies and creates a vicious debt cycle. So let's take a look at the fiscal situation as of now, try to examine that. And first up, let me introduce my panel for today. We've got Professor Arun Kumar, who's joining us from the Institute of Social Sciences. We've got Professor Shivaji Shorkar, Registered Dean and Director of the Mangalayatan University. From the BJP, we've got Tina Sharma to give us the government voice, Rahul Agarwal for the wealth discovery, Jagdish Shettikar, Professor of the Birla Institute of Management Technology, the venue for our special round table. Also, my colleague Ridhima is joined by a host of young and bright minds who are trying to figure out what is the best road for India ahead. First up, a look at the fiscal situation as of now on your screen. The state of affairs. 2003, the FRBM targets are constantly being revised and unfortunately never met. The 3% target remains simply elusive. The current account deficit hit by oil price spikes and a falling rupee. GST collection improvements are there, but they're simply insufficient to override expenditure. The election spending will have its own impact on the fiscal situation. There's been a growth slowdown. In fact, we woefully slowed down to sub 6%. The SOPs to farmers need to continue. Several high spending government schemes. Inflation is muted despite high oil prices due to a weak demand. But having said that, we still have high expectations, great expectations coming up on your screen. That's the target for 22-23, where the debt to GDP ratio target is 38%. The fiscal deficit target is 2.5%, and importantly, the revenue deficit is sub 1 at 0.8%. The state of affairs is quite critical, might I add, Professor Arun Kumar.
So, the fiscal deficit is the difference between the total expenditure and the total revenue of the government. So we need the expenditure figure and the revenue figure. Now both have been misestimated because we assumed in the budget last year 11.5% rate of growth, where the rate of growth was much lower. So therefore our revenues have not been up to target. The GST is short by about 80,000 crores, direct taxes are short by about 80,000 crores. So you had a 1,60,000 crores shortfall in revenue. So you cut back expenditure of about 1.6 lakh crores so that you could maintain the 3.4% fiscal deficit target. But in a situation where demand was less, if you cut back expenditures, then it leads to further decline. And this is where I think the problem is, that in the interim budget, we've announced many expenditures, but they're not covered by revenues, corresponding revenues. And given the particular state of affairs at the moment, we should require 22% increase in revenue, which is very unlikely. And therefore, this 3.4% target is again going to be breached unless we cut back expenditure, which will
which again is not possible, Professor
Which is again going to create problems for growth.
In a situation like this, do you think we need to examine the fiscal deficit very closely, given that we have a growth fall? In fact, it was just about sub 6% of a growth, which is way away from the double digit we were expecting. In a situation like this, the relevance of the fiscal deficit, does it get diluted?
Of course. You see, even fiscal deficit concept itself Even if you go into the FRBM Act, it accepts the fact there has to be some percentage of fiscal deficit. And what percent, whether 3% ideal or 5% ideal, that's a different issue. So, fiscal deficit is built into the system. So, that means, of course, the basic concept in that is there would be certain amount of deficit which you can borrow and you can make it up next year. That is the, but the basic thing what has happened now is that there is a mismatch between the revenue collections and mismatch between the growth. Now, when the growth comes down, automatically government collections come down. Now, if that growth is not there, you see, government collects many taxes because there is a sale in the market, the market is booming, and from that government earns. If the market itself is not working, then that aspect
I think that's the worry. It's not only the current fiscal deficit, it's the accumulated fiscal deficit
of course
on which you have a high interest payment.
Absolutely.
And that's what retards your progress. And there's only that limit, Tina Sharma. You can only borrow that much to be able to grow. And you need to grow. So what do? Because if you continue to grow with a higher fiscal deficit, people will stop lending you money.
True, but then we need to understand that, you know, this fiscal deficit, higher fiscal deficit has come from legacy, and also we need to understand that, you know, 4.6 inflation rate, which is the lowest since 1991 for any Indian government. That's been in there in our, you know, government.
Well, I'm sorry, that's because of a weak demand. Just the way you have an argument, you can have a higher fiscal deficit to promote growth. You can accommodate a higher inflation to promote growth.
Mr. Modi has quoted this in Global Summit during his Gujarat recent program. So I don't think a Prime Minister would quote anything wrong.
Would you have a low inflation with a
Chetan, I'm not getting into numbers which is behind this, but then if you're saying that Mr. Modi has lied on this number.
No, I'm not saying he's lying. What I'm trying to say is that inflation at a low is because of low demand. Right now you need a higher demand, so you can compromise on inflation. Inflation can be compromised because you need to stimulate growth. That's really the problem, Rahul.
That's absolutely right, but then we need to understand that, you know, we are trying to control fiscal deficit, and I think we have already brought a lot of reforms in the parliament. I mean, bankruptcy, insolvency, and your goods and service tax. These are the reforms, and I think government will remain tax or you know, somewhat tax saving government, and also reform minded government.
So that's what I look at. Let's revisit the relevance of a fiscal deficit in a falling market, falling in terms of slowdown. How much of credence would you give it? How much of importance would you give it?
See, the point is, if the situation is like this, what are you going to do? What can you do? Can you just cut back on expenses and sit there and let the economy falter even more? So I think the best thing, or the only option, sometimes you are constrained with the number of options you have. So you have to stimulate the economy, right? And you cannot cut the expenses, because to stimulate the economy, you have to make those expenses. So it's a catch-22 that the government has to deal with as of now. And I think the government should let this, you know, fiscal worry down the line, slip it down the line for next two years.
Professor Setikar, you've been a part of governments, of the BJP government, of their think tank. You've been also a noted economist. What would you do?
I think we should understand how crucial it is to adhere to the fiscal discipline. Now, that is the reason why earlier the Vajpayee government implemented this FRBM Act in 2003, because prior to that, more than 53% of the revenue collection used to go just for the payment of the interest payment or the old loan plus principal payment due during that year.
But if we continue this progress, the interest will only go higher.
No, that is why we had to cut down. That is the reason why after FRBM Act was implemented, the fiscal deficit has been slowly brought down, and as per that target, the 2018-19 it was to be 3%, but because of the government spending more than 72,000 crores on the cash transfer, though it has become 3.4%. Now, what exactly will be the in the fiscal deficit position, that will come to know only on 5th of July, because there is a report of shortfall in the tax collection to the extent of nearly 85,000 crores. So, whether there is any been saving on the front of the expenditure, we do not know. But when it comes to the crucial, I mean how crucial it is.
Right.
Number one, unlike the pre-1991 days, the government doesn't have the luxury of asking the RBI to print the currency notes.
Sure.
It has to come to the market and borrow, which means that its immediate impact will be the interest payment will go up, rate will go up, which even the private borrower will also have to pay.
Which is
now, which
counterproductive
means
for growth
that
anyway.
the rise in the cost of
Exactly,
production,
exactly.
which will be passed on to the consumer.
Not just that, it will
Yeah.
also would lead to a
No.
demand degrowth.
Now,
if you
other
keep increasing
aspect
interest
is that
rates.
if some companies prefer to go to the international market and try to raise the fund through the external commercial borrowing, there the interest rate depends on the rating of the country, which directly related to the credibility of the government. Now, the moment the rating agencies look at the situation
Sure.
that the government has moved away from its own commitment, they downgrade the country, and our borrowers will have to pay the higher interest rate, which will be passed again to the consumer.
So there's no doubt it's a catch-22, but the question is that should we, this time round, salvage and overlook the fiscal deficit to promote growth? What do the young minds think, Ridhima?
Absolutely. You know, Chetan, for some of the young minds, many of these numbers are pretty baffling. So I'm actually going to begin with a little quiz to ask these youngsters if they even understand these numbers. You know, a lot of numbers being thrown around. We always talk about this 3% number, whether it's elusive. We say we had an inheritance of about 4.1%, but the interim budget said about 3.4%. Will that number be breached at this point of time? I mean, the situation currently is not so great, because we should understand that the deficit keeps accumulating. And at this point of time, if the government does breach, then the credibility does come under scanner. But before we get to that, let's just understand what fiscal deficit really means to you. When these numbers are thrown, what do these numbers really mean to you?
I feel like it's the credibility for the government. It's a financial credibility for the government, which it is being raising up high and high upon the people of India actually.
Okay, so you feel the fiscal deficit defines the credibility of the government in some sense. Okay, what about you?
Ma'am, I think it defines that it is the difference between the, like, what is the income of the government and the spending of the government. Like, if there's more spending, so India is in a fiscal deficit state. So.
Okay, he's memorized his answer, but let me ask one of the girls here as well. When these numbers are thrown around, you know, we say that whether the 3% figure is achievable, we still at 3.4%, which was the interim budget number. Will we have the same number being maintained? What do these numbers make sense to you?
I guess we should focus more on income, because we are lagging behind our revenue expectations, and we should cut down our expenditure as well.
Okay, so Chetan, most of them are now trying to say, you know, some of them have read up their answers, some of them have picked up on what the panelists were also trying to say, but we should understand that every time we talk about the fiscal deficit, it is a catch-22 situation, whether we talk about the revenue or we talk about the expenditure. So most of them have a fair enough idea of what the numbers really look like. 5th July will give us a better idea of what these numbers now look for the year coming ahead.
I think the fact of the matter is everybody realizes there's a challenge at hand when it comes to the fiscal deficit. And the question is that can credibility fight a credible growth? We take a look at the challenges in just a moment.
On the tax front, what has happened over the last couple of years is that we have found that the tax collection has become stagnant and the tax base is also not growing. So the big expectation that I have is that we will take up some measures with which the tax base will become broader and tax collection will go up.
She can make a proper budget now to encourage the growth of the economy and to make it stronger, to improve the balance of payments.
Welcome back to the Confidence Budget 2019. We're talking about the fiscal situation, which looks grim, where the government, year after year, time after time, seems to fail to meet that target of 3%. This time round, situations are even worse, given a slowing economy. What then are the challenges? It's coming up on your screen. The challenges of the fiscal deficit: farm loan waivers, bank NPAs, lower tax collections, sluggish economy, inflation, and enhanced government spending, which will continue and needs to continue. Take a look at the current situation of the rupee, where does it come from, where does it go? First, the receipts, tax collections, income tax 16 paise to the rupee, corporate tax is 19 paise, GST etc. at 23 paise, excise at 8 paise, customs at 4 paise. Very important, the borrowings out there at 19 paise. That's 19% of the entire pie of receipts come from borrowings. A fifth of the pie comes from borrowings. On the expenditure side, you've got the schemes, the government schemes, which have 9 paise and 10 paise, defense at 9 paise, pensions at 5 paise, state's share of taxes at 24 paise, and very importantly out here, the interest payments. That's the accumulated interest over the years. That's what the burden of the fiscal deficit really, the overhang, how it disallows you to grow, is at a fifth, at a whopping 18%, as are subsidies, which are at 9 paise. Professor Arun Kumar, not a pretty picture, certainly.
Yes. Globally, even developing countries have a much higher direct tax GDP ratio than we have, which is about 5.75%, and the total tax GDP ratio is about 17%, which is very low compared to global requirement. So our incomes are very low compared to the expenditures, and especially in the new situation that we are in. Second point I want to make is that this fiscal deficit is not the fiscal deficit of the government as a whole. It's only of the center. We have the state's fiscal deficit.
Which comes out to be, I think, about 6.5 to 7%.
And also the public sector undertakings fiscal deficit, because they have a high IEBR, what's called the internal extra budgetary resources from the public sector. So fiscal deficit is much higher than what the 3% figure is. Therefore, we have to worry about where are we going to have revenues from, because what happened in disinvestment was we put the burden on the public sector. They bought the shares.
Professor Sharkar, are we to focus on revenues or expenditure or both? Where would you like to be focusing on?
It has to be both, you see. You have
but in a situation where you have to spend, the government has to spend, how do you control expenditure beyond a point? You have to spend.
One thing over the years we have ignored. Rather, that has become one problem for us. Now you're talking about bank NPAs. Bank NPAs are there, but at the same time, corporate savings are growing. They have not used their savings. At the same time, if you look at the national savings rate, that is coming down. You see, if you look through when it was called the Hindu rate of growth, the entire economy subsisted on that basic tax savings by the people. Somehow we are trying to ignore that aspect. Number two.
No, what do you mean by somehow they're trying to ignore? I mean,
we are virtually ignoring that aspect.
Right.
It has come down to an abysmal low.
Yes.
You see, most of the development aspects that were taken care of, say 60s and 70s or even 50s, it has come through those basic savings. Why are we ignoring it? That we need to look at. You see, we have to look at all these aspects in totality. When you look at one by another, then you will miss on another point. So we have not looked at the whole economy in a wholesome manner. That holistic approach we have to have. Why the rural economy is going down? Why the urban economy is suffering? So we have to have a total look at it. And the tax rate you are seeing is also remains very high on the individual. That we also not looked at.
So Tina Sharma, you're in a catch-22, right? Your government is in a catch-22. You need to spend. You have been very ambitious in your expenditure. You've already announced, further SOPs and incentives for the farmers. You've got a lot of incentive, very noble and very effective schemes. Where do you get the money from? Where does the tax come? In a falling economy, you are not able to broaden the tax, right? The GST has not been effective enough. What do you do?
I believe that government will have a broader perspective on these, gray areas where we've not, we are expecting lesser taxes this time, and also to understand that.
If you expect lesser taxes, how do you expect taxes to? Where do you get the money from? I mean, either you may get more people to pay lesser taxes, then you have a higher tax to GDP ratio.
So I'm looking at more reforms coming from the government, and I think when we'll have more reforms, then government probably would have planned something on this front. So I think we will not fail if we get lesser taxes. I think we should have plan 2 with us.
Rahul Agarwal, is the government's ability limited?
Obviously, the government's ability is limited because this government, I expect, the track record has that, this government is fiscally responsible. So they brought down the fiscal deficit from 4.1 to 3.4. Now they will lose credibility, if you take it back from 3.4 to upwards, right? So I think it is tough for the government as of now, but there is no solution. They have to stimulate growth, and for that they have to spend. There's nothing, no two ways about it. But as they say, when you are in trouble, you pray, and I think their prayers have been heard. You know, the Vimal Jalan committee is working on it, and I expect that at least 2 to 3 lakh crore from the Reserve Bank would flow into the government coffers. That will be able to.
But that's an accounting transfer. Is that the best way forward,
But
Professor
still,
Shettikar? I mean, you just cook the books.
No, right now the government has got the luxury of taking the harsh measures because the initial 3 years.
Exactly.
The government,
The reformist
government can
part, yes.
initiate the tough, harsh, the reforms measure. The government should go ahead because by introducing the reforms measure, you can attract the investors even from the foreign investors also already, especially at this situation when the trade war is going on. The many investors are ready to come to the India because they think that the India is the best place for the investment. I am sure that further, though government has initiated the many game-changing policies during the last 5 years like bankruptcy code or the GST, and when it comes to the GST, let me also say that it is not the ideal GST. The ideal GST, whichever the country which has introduced the GST, except couple of countries, in all the countries it is a single GST rate, and only in the 2 countries there is a double GST rate. But in order
So
to
do you
get
see that happening this time?
this time, I don't think that,
But they need to aspire, they need to
government
get to
has
that.
indicated that slowly they will cut down the GST
One
rates
tax,
from 5.
one tax rate. As
Yeah,
well.
one tax, one rate. And the government's problem is that right now there is a rural crisis, and it may feel like helping the rural sector, but my advice is that it should not approach what you call the traditional approach, like giving the doles like farm waivers loan or giving the stimulus. It should reforms even in the agricultural sector, because what is affecting the rural sector is, one, farmers not having the access to the market, and here the middlemen are exploiting the farmers when the cost of agricultural operation has been going up. And the second, the lack of infrastructure related to the farm sector, about which in the very first meeting of the cabinet, the government has given indications that they are going to promote what we call the rural infrastructures like cold chains or the refrigerated transportation system.
Right.
So that the farmers can wait till they get the right
Fair enough.
price for their
Fair
product.
enough. So precious little can be done on the expenditure side except for infusing and enforcing accountability. Lots is to be done on the income side. Let's hear the young minds, Ridhima, to try and understand what do they think. How can the government raise money?
Right, I think other than that, Chetan, I think I'd like to put a interesting question for the youngsters, because you know every time we talk about fiscal deficit, it's a catch-22 situation or a double-edged sword, because you talk about revenue, you talk about expenditure. Even if the revenue is not coming in, the expenditure bill is being generated. For example, for an economy like India, you don't have a very widened tax base. So even if your revenue inflow is less, you do have an outflow of your expenditure. So I'm going to put the students actually in a catch-22 and help us understand what is more important. Is revenue more important or is expenditure more important, and how do you really reach that equilibrium? So what is more important is, we always talk about, you know, the two words that we talk about when we talk about fiscal deficit is revenue as well as expenditure. So what is more important?
I feel like if we can reduce our expenditures, this may result to a better situation which we are facing right now. So I think that we must reduce our expenditures.
Okay, so there's one for expenditure.
Ma'am, I think that we should generate more income so that the population that is unemployed, they too pay taxes, and thus the deficit can be controlled.
Okay, so there's one for income, one for expenditure. What do you think?
I think we should focus on income, as I already said, by widening our tax bases and to cut down our expenditure as well.
Okay. So Chetan, a mixed view there coming in, but to be fair, we all do understand how important maintaining that equilibrium is. A fiscal deficit is all about getting that gap reduced between your revenue as well as expenditure. So most of the young minds here are some in favor of income, some in favor of expenditure, but we at India Ahead trying to find solutions of how really to get that gap narrowed between the revenue as well as the expenditure.
We have to think broadly and we have to widen our thoughts as well as our tax base. That seems to be the culmination of the challenges when more people need to pay less tax. Of course, it's got to be a reformist budget, a budget which promotes investment as well as disinvestment. We'll examine that in just a moment.
Coming to specifics on direct tax front, since SSCs less than 5 lakh rupees have been given exemption, I expect the basic exemption limit to go up significantly.
Welcome back to the Confidence Budget 2019. We're discussing the fiscal deficit and that mythical 3% mark. So far, we've talked about the state of affairs, the challenges, and now it's to do what India Ahead does best, is to look deeply and identify solutions. Here are the India Ahead solutions. Widen the tax base, resolve tax disputes, enhance compliance, recapitalization of PSU banks, resolving the NBFC default crisis. Importantly, recover scam wealth, return overseas unaccounted wealth, audit government schemes effectively, look at the possibility of the free convertibility of the rupee, resist farm loan waivers which are counterproductive or unless very necessary and not only populist. Revive private investment, promote disinvestment, examine wealth tax and inheritance tax, and persist with cash transfers for schemes. So, Professor Arun Kumar, there are ways out of the catch-22.
So I think what you're proposing are pretty good solutions, to the problem. But let me analyze it a bit more. Today, what you have is a problem on the revenue account. They're committed expenditures, like interest is committed, defense is committed. Broadly, subsidies are also committed. It's not easy to cut subsidies immediately.
Right.
So therefore, revenue account expenditures are committed. So you need more revenue so that you can bring the revenue deficit down to zero, and that will help to control the fiscal deficit, because then your borrowing will become less and less. So how do you raise revenues? That becomes a crucial thing. And as you suggest, wealth taxation, estate duty, gift taxation goes along with that. Those will be very crucial. Broadening the tax base, because today our taxation of income begins at 500% of the per capita income, 5 lakh rupees roughly, Now that's a very high number, and that's why the base is very narrow. How do you broaden that base? That becomes crucial, and for that you need to check the black economy. And when you impose wealth taxation at the proper level, then that brings in increased income taxation as well. So therefore, wealth taxation becomes a very crucial thing.
Yeah, but somewhere down the line, Professor Sarkar, I mean, you can tax, the rich more. There is a case for that. I mean, of course, you reduce the disparities of income, but it also disincentivizes prosperity.
Absolutely disincentivizes prosperity. Apart from that, what is the number of real rich in this country? That also you have to look at. You see, it is just not going on increasing and widening the base.
It's not the number of real, it's the amount of wealth they control, which is large.
That is very large.
But have as much as 700 million people.
Yes,
good.
That is where the issue is.
Those disparities are very stark.
The disparity is very wide. Now, how you can bring that down? You see, I told you in the beginning, we have to do a very thoughtful thinking on these issues. I think the Niti Aayog is there, whatever the Planning Commission concept was, that has gone. But we should use this forum to see why the problem is in agriculture, why the problem is in industry, why the problem is in manufacturing, why people are not going to the market to purchase. So these are all related issues. These are not single issues. That separate.
What are the solutions from your point of view?
This is the solution is you have to look at in a holistic manner the entire thing. The taxes you say at the individual level, if you see, even in Indian beggar pays 40% taxes.
No, I said widen the tax base.
No, widening the tax base, there is a problem you see. How much widen you it? You see, even now, you see the 30% is the tax on the individual taxpayer. Very few pay 20%. Most of that has gone below the 5 lakh limit. Now they would have virtually integrated that up to that limit. There won't be any
Fair
taxes.
enough, yeah.
So now, in fact, say about 50% of the taxpayers have gone out of that net.
Yeah.
Now
So-
you have to look for a new way to
So
do
we
it.
need, and but there are new people, there are no new incomes, there are new jobs,
No,
there
everything
are
is
new,
there.
there are new sectors which are rising. I think
Yes.
you have to examine those
But there
which are propping
there
up
is
the
also another
economy.
aspect. We
So
are
where-
also having so many fees and tolls. That also you need to see whether we should have it or not.
So from the government point of view, Tina Sharma, where do you think that the solutions will really lie?
See, our party campaign manifesto 2019 had 4 things, which is largely, business environment we need to improve. Then your governance standards we need to improve. We are committed on this. Then strengthening infra. And then last thing was stimulated the manufacturing sector through a new industry policy. If these 4 things, as committed by our government, works out well, then we are done with, good.
You think that's good enough to stimulate demand, which will promote
Initially,
growth,
it will be good
which
enough
will
to
increase taxes?
Yes, initially it will be good. If we run it through these scanners, then I think we'll have a
So
right
you
track.
think the government schemes if implemented properly,
Yes, that's
are enough to even overcome the fiscal deficit of 3%?
Yes.
Rav.
I have a slightly different take. To me, I think the government or the country needs higher growth. If we were having 11% growth, for example, we wouldn't be having this debate. So it all boils down to a robust economy.
But how do you get 11%
That's
growth?
what
You have to
I'm
reach
trying
that level.
That's where I'm getting at.
Yeah,
To get there to a higher growth trajectory, what's happening in India right now is the private expansion has stalled. The private expansion has stalled because the banks are not lending to it. So the government has to jumpstart the economy, and for that they have to do public spending, and that would increase the deficit. So that's all right.
So
for
these
the
are
next
the
2 years.
basic
surprised,
reforms,
Professor
Chetan.
Shettikar, that
Chetan,
nobody's
these are
talked
the
about,
basic reforms which
nobody's
are
talked
told.
about disinvestment.
I was going to
Yeah,
say
of
that
course.
actually.
Professor Shettikar, you've been a huge advocate of disinvestment. Nobody's talked about return of black wealth, a huge amount of unaccounted wealth. We've imposed the people sitting in this country. We put them to all kinds of difficult situations, and we've not been able to recover the wealth from overseas.
No, as far as the disinvestment is concerned, last year against the target of 80,000 crores, the government has been able to mobilize 85,000 crores through the disinvestment. And in principle, the disinvestment is to improve the governance, corporate governance, by handing over the control to the private sector. But that is not happening. But the way the disinvestment has taken place of late, I am not in favor of that, because disinvestment means that it is in a way it is a privatization. Here one PSU buying the shares of another PSU, and it is practically the different PSUs buying each other the PSUs. So that is not
that's another book entry,
the original
virtually.
purpose of the disinvestment.
robbing Peter to pay
You
Paul.
cannot privatize that. And coming to the expanding the tax base, and because of the cutting down of the tax rate over the years, now the maximum tax rate is 30% income tax, and compared to 73, 74, when the maximum tax rate, income tax, is 97.75%. And as a result, the revenue collections has gone up, because in fact there is a theory what is called the Laffer's curve,
Yes,
which
the
has
Laffer.
proved all over the
It's
world,
counterproductive.
the lower the tax rate, higher will be the tax
Absolutely,
collection.
yeah.
But when it comes to the expenditure, I don't advise cutting down the expenditure per se, but what is required is the improving the quality of the expenditure. If you spend on the developmental, then it is okay.
Not just the quality, sir, even
Yeah.
the accountability. Whether the expenditure.
That is why when I say the quality,
yeah.
accountability with the minimum scope for the leakage, which the government has done substantially through the digitization of the economy, or linking the welfare measures
transfer.
to the Aadhaar or your PAN card, there is a little scope for the evasion of the tax. So things have been improving, but still there are a lot of, the things government has to initiate over there.
Well, solutions are for India ahead, solutions are on India ahead, and solutions will have to come from the minds of tomorrow who will take India ahead. Ridhima, the young minds.
Absolutely, Chetan. We started with the great expectations on India Ahead, and now India Ahead putting out these solutions, which we believe as a channel. And we've already listed out the current issues that we have. We are looking at a slowdown. The growth rate is under question at this point of time. A lot of interesting points that I picked up from the panel as well. Professor Arun Kumar made a very valid point that the revenue deficit at this point of time is actually the big concern. But how do you really understand whether can you reduce your expenditure at this point of time, even when your revenue is a shortfall? So let's understand from the young minds, what do you think is the solution? We've spoken so much about how there is a crisis in the NBFC space, the NPAs are rising, there is no growth, all looks like a grim picture. But let's talk about the positive aspect now. What are the solutions?
I feel like we must check the rate of money which are being spent in the government policies right now. If we can control that rate, means the policies which are not working out, which are not making the penetration, if we can control that, we can then make some changes in the policies and we can make some changes in the economy as well.
Okay, fair enough. What do you think are the solutions? We've all spoken about the red flags, we've addressed the challenges, but what's the way forward? What are the solutions to curb that gap?
Ma'am, I think that the government should collect the funds from like the tax. Basically, I'll be talking about the tax slab. So for a person who's earning 5 lakh rupees and 10 lakh rupees, the slab is same. And for a person who's earning 10 lakh rupees, the inferior good would be different from a person who's earning 5 lakh rupees.
Okay. So are you saying a widening of tax bags is concerned, or are you trying to make a different point?
I'm trying to say that the tax slab should be like this, 5 to 7 lakh. The
okay.
Should small.
Okay. What do you think are the solutions for a way forward? We've spoken about how there's always going to be a catch-22 situation between your revenue and expenditure, but how do you solve that situation?
Yeah, in my opinion, the tax basis should be examined again. And like for various sectors, it should be widened. Whereas in the growing sectors like insurance, where the penetration level is only 3.7, which is very lesser than the other developed countries. So the GST should be reduced or cut down from 18%.
Okay. Chetan, you heard some of their young minds there, some interesting points there coming up, mostly some of them echoing the fact that you and the panelists were also trying to establish that maybe at this point of time, a widening of tax base would probably a solution that could be looked at to fight this crisis of the fiscal deficit, and so that we don't say that the 3% is a myth anymore.
Well, so several solutions from young minds, several solutions from old minds, and all lead up to great expectations of the budget 2019. July 5th will answer a lot of those questions. Of course, a lot of this happens outside the budget, but a lot can happen within the budget. They form the expectations. What will they be? Let's take a look at that after the break.
The big expectation I have is that the government is going to do something to increase the tax base. The income tax base, it is going to ensure that GST collections exceed 1 lakh crores that is happening right now, and it is going to do some creative measure for increasing the tax to GDP ratio. 3 expectations.
I don't want the government to tinker with estate duty or the Wealth Tax Act. Let it remain in whatever form it is. Estate duty has been removed with effect from 1985. So if they think of reintroducing it, that would be a huge retrograde step.
Welcome back to the Confidence Budget 2019. We're in the final phase of this program, where we're now going to examine the great expectations from July the 5th. What possibly can we see this time round in a budget which promises to be a reformist budget, being year 1 of Narendra Modi government 2.0. Professor Arun Kumar, your take.
So, we need a lot of expenditures to boost the economy, farm sector, employment, etc., etc. So we need more revenues. Where do we get more revenues? One suggestion has been to get it from the RBI, but that will be monetizing, and create a lot of problems.
That's a book entry. I mean, we need
That's a book,
income
absolutely.
generation. Yeah.
But if you actually get the book entry to transfer to the government, you'll be creating a lot of money supply. That'll create a lot of other problems. So that's not a thing. Foreign investment is only 5% of total Indian investment. That's not a solution. So where do you get the solution? The solution is by broadening the tax base and increasing capital expenditure.
Give me specific.
Yeah, so
specific.
increasing capital expenditure in the budget. Where do you increase capital expenditure in the budget? As I've been saying, on education, on health, and on these certain items. And for that, you need to widen the tax base through wealth taxation, estate duty, and through
So
gift
you want to see
taxation.
wealth tax, estate duty
and
brought
gift
brought
tax
back,
to-
and gift tax.
so that we can get more revenue to expend on these things.
All right, three big question marks. I mean, there'll be a lot of agony for that, but there, of course, there are a lot of people who advocate that as well. Professor Shorkar.
You see, we are targeting a 5 trillion economy by 24. So we need to make the growth rate faster.
Right.
You see, it has to be very doubled. Now, if you have 6%,
So you're
if you
looking
have
at some tax incentives. What are you looking at?
No, taxes have to be rationalized. You see, there is hardly any scope. Whatever you're saying, we have given up most of these things
So
earlier.
what can, because we are short of time, what is it that you want to see in the budget?
I want to see in the budget rationalization of taxes and expenditure. You
Any
see,
specific move, any specific policy?
look, if you want to say policy, it has to be one thing, how you can bring down the tax rates and move up the growth. You see, there is
So
lots
you want to see lower taxes? You're advocating
lower taxes and expenditures. Like you are going on spending on many kinds of security services. Whether we really need to look at that or not, we have to cut down on all those kinds of expenses.
So rationalization of expenses, some expenses have to be done away with, but lowering of taxes, I think that's your big argument. What about you, Tina?
I would say that we should have inclusive budget, and whatever has come from this panel.
I mean, what does that mean?
Inclusive
I mean,
budget
it's a great
is
statement, but how does it translate into a budget?
It should be in the interest of country, and we should have also, on the contrary, we should have,
One way of having an inclusive budget is by making more people pay less taxes. You're including everybody.
Why not?
To pay taxes.
Why not?
Any other way that you think that the
Reforms
budget could,
and
any particular reform you're looking at personally, as a professional, as a woman entrepreneur, or your working style?
let's see.
All right. What about you, Rahul?
Well, I have a whole list of things that needs to be done.
Okay.
The first thing I would say is the government has to spend big, right? We should worry about the deficit 2 years down the line.
Give me expectations. Class.
My expectation is the government will spend a lot of money in water. We already.
Fair enough. Expenditure and water, you want to hear that. What else do you want to hear on this?
I want a lot of focus on disinvestment. Like, for example, Air India needs to get rid of BSNL,
Mrs.
MTNL.
Sitharaman speak on disinvestment. You want to hear her speak on
other
water.
things
What
that,
else?
For example, BSNL, MTNL, they are spending so much money on the salaries. So they are the prime.
Fair enough. You heard disinvestment. What else?
Monetizing other assets of the PSU, like for example, railways is sitting on a large tract of land which is encroached. If you unencroach it and make it commercial, alternative source of revenues. Taxation is not the solution. People will run away to tax havens. That's what my belief is.
Creative thinking, good creative thinking. What about you, Professor Shettikar?
The government should implement the direct tax code by raising the exemption limit. The indication is already
I think that's almost a given.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
it is
what
come.
yeah.
And
but is that enough? I mean,
no, that is not enough. As far as the disinvestment is concerned, it should go in a big way. But as per the suggestions given in the Disinvestment Commission during the 2000.
What else? Anything else we can expect?
The government
Come on,
should
as an economist,
try
give us
to
one
utilize
disruptive thing that this budget can bring about. It has to be a reformist budget.
Ideal wealth remaining in the hands with the temples and all. I don't advocate what they call the taxing them. Maybe some sort of thing, the bonds.
That's
bonds
interesting
the bonds,
in a government which has been questioned.
Like there are many temples with the idol.
It's interesting. This is interesting. A government which has been questioned for secularism. I mean, if you're going to get back funds from the temple, it's a great move. It's a bold move.
But I am not in favor of what they call the wealth tax or the gift tax, because as long as the wealth is invested for the productive purpose, we should not tax the wealth generating capacity of the people. We should have the broader, after all, whoever earn the wealth, So they have contributed to the development of the society. The government is just a facilitator and it cannot play a proactive role in the development.
So several expectations, a lot of expectations from the old wine. Let's see our expectations from the new bottles. Ridhima.
Absolutely, Chetan, and I'm going to leave the economic jargon and I'm going to just quickly open the floor to ask the youth of what their expectations are. A maiden budget by Nirmala Sitharaman on the 5th of July. The wish list is getting longer. What do you want to see on the 5th of July?
I think I want that there should be income generation budget and that would help in tax revenue, increase in the tax revenue. That would decrease the deficit.
Okay. Personally, as a management student who's going to be out for the job market in a couple of years, what do you want to see in the budget?
I'm here, I'll say it should be a round robin budget for everyone as a citizen of India and as a management student. I want medical facilities at the ground level should also be addressed, people getting the low wages should also be addressed, and at the same time people going on strike like doctors should also be addressed at the same time.
That's a personal concern there coming in. Every time we talk about a budget, and most of the people talk about how much reduction of taxes will they see, how many savings can I have this year. Is sort of a rationalization of taxes on the wish list for some of you as well?
Yes, ma'am, mainly on the loans for education or for the loans that are required for the businesses, because India is a country of youth and we should promote more and more entrepreneurs so that we become job creators rather than seekers.
Okay, I think that's a very, very well put point, that we need to be job creators rather than just job providers at this point of time. But Chetan, how it is when you talk to the Aam Aadmi or the common man, the one wish list that always remains over the years is rationalization of taxes, as well as some sort of relief on the expenditure side as well, which I think is what the young minds also resonating at this point of time.
Well, a whole lot of expectations, some old, some new, some very, very disruptive, some very, very creative. But why shouldn't we have these expectations? We voted in a government back to power, the incumbent government, to do just that, to take bold reformist measures to take India ahead. Well, that's round 3 of our discussion roundtables. Round 4 comes up tomorrow. We've so far discussed fiscal deficit, jobs and growth. Round 4, we will question, is it time now to severely axe the tax? Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.